HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gifted Generation, When Government Was Good, by David Goldfield, read by Mike Chamberlain. Introduction. Good Government. This book is about the first boomers, the gifted generation, born into America in the 1940s and early 1950s, and the gifts they received from government. Thanks to federal policies that eased the way for their parents and made achievement more realizable for themselves, they were twice as likely as their parents to attend college, also aided by the federal government. The boom economy after World War II hummed along in great part because of their needs: food, clothing, education, electronics, toys, and housing, and everything that could go into a home, from air conditioning units to dishwashers to vacuum cleaners. Their educational attainments fueled the transformation of the nation's economy and spurred innovation and invention. The gifts kept on giving, not only to the gifted generation and their offspring, but also to the commonwealth. What I call the commonwealth ideal defined governance in the United States during the first 2 decades after World War II. The ideal followed 3 basic principles of governance. First, government should enhance opportunities for all Americans. By benefiting individuals, public policy enhanced the Commonwealth, in turn freeing its citizens to pursue their dreams. Second, the ideal charged government with the responsibility of balancing competing interests, individuals, business and industry, and government itself, to benefit the nation. Third, the Commonwealth ideal required obedience to the rule of law. The Constitution, as interpreted by the federal judiciary, serves as the ultimate guarantor of equality before the law. The ideal worked best when citizens believed the government kept their interests paramount. That was the case during the Great Depression and World War II. Once those crises ended, maintaining the Commonwealth ideal became more difficult. Yet, for a remarkable 20-year period following the war, the federal government did just that. 3 presidents, Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Lyndon B. Johnson, of similar family and geographic backgrounds, and each shaped by depression and war, expanded opportunities for a broad cross-section of Americans, who, in turn, produced an era of prosperity and innovation. Public policy provided the gifts, and Americans, especially those of the gifted generation, ran with them. Government responded to the changing circumstances of American life: the baby boom, an economy transitioning to a post-industrial society, and the growing awareness that significant segments of the population, the poor, women, African Americans, and ethnic and religious minorities, encountered too many obstacles on the journey toward reaching their full potential. Major government initiatives in education, research, civil rights, welfare, and immigration followed. These were not merely top-down measures. Consciousness-raising books on gender, the environment, and poverty spurred federal action as well. Key legislation involved collaborations among organizations, individual citizens, and the government. Their combined efforts, marshaled by forward-looking presidents, created a more equitable, inclusive, and educated America. Government was indeed good. It was hardly surprising that, by the mid-1960s, nearly 80% of Americans believed that to be the case, compared with less than 20% in 2015. The gifted generation was indeed blessed. Generation is an amorphous concept. The 2 most common dictionary definitions, a group of individuals born and living contemporaneously, or the span of time between the birth of parents and that of their offspring, are, respectively, vague and fluid. The phrase baby boom generation is similarly indeterminate. The U.S. Census Bureau set the boundaries of that generation between 1946 and 1964, supposedly based on birth rate statistics. But those born at the beginning of the boom and those toward the end grew up in very different circumstances. The baby boom actually began in the early 1940s, perhaps as soon as 1940, when births spiked. Popular magazines at the end of World War II were already touting an ongoing boom, which they traced back to 1941. By 1943, demographers were identifying a baby boom, citing that year's record crop of babies, which followed high birth rates the previous 3 years. They attributed the rapid rise in the birth rate to the return of prosperity and the exigencies of war. Recently, demographers have further challenged the census's 1946 starting year for the boom by questioning the usual explanation for the boom: prosperity and the pent-up demand for marriage and family. Prosperity was already evident by 1940 as the United States geared up for the war. Marriages spiked as well in the early 1940s, indicating the desire to begin a family before men went off to war. The boom, in other words, began well before 1946. Walter T.K. Nugent, who has studied the boomers perhaps more than any other historian, concluded, "Conventional wisdom starts the baby boom in 1946. That's erroneous. Bedroom behavior changed at the beginning of World War II, not after it ended." The first boomers were more than a cohort of a larger group. They were distinctive in numbers, experience, and impact. 32 million babies were born during the 1940s, a 25% increase over the previous decade, the largest jump in American history to that point. Their influence on culture, the economy, and, ultimately, the political process announced the emergence of a new generation, a term I use with the caveats noted, but also because the size and influence of the early boomers justify the designation. The first wave of baby boomers had very different trajectories from the boomers born from the mid-1950s onward. The early boomers grew up in the 1950s, entered college at the beginning of the 1960s, and by the end of that decade embarked on a variety of careers, many of which did not exist at the time they were in high school. Journalists and demographers have abandoned any pretense that the early boomers and the late boomers shared anything except the census definition of the boomer generation. Journalist Richard Perez Peña argued that the boomer generation had two distinct halves: boomer classic and boomer reboot, with the latter born in the mid-1950s and after, and coming of age in the early 1970s, a very different time from the early 1960s, when the post-war idealism of limitless progress and equality prevailed. Boomer reboot also faced 3 recessions between 1973 and 1982, 2 energy crises, inflation, and high unemployment. Teacher Jean O'Brien, recalling her students at Palisades High School in Santa Monica, California, between 1965 and 1975, termed that decade the saddest years of the century. The expectations of the students were as high as their predecessors, perhaps even higher, she related. But the promise of the early years dissolved. The unbounded belief carried by the early boomers, the gifted generation, that they would find not only meaningful work, but also a fulfilling life, began to recede by the 1970s. The early boomers took a prosperous economy for granted, which enabled them to pursue nothing less than the reformation of the nation in civil rights, immigration, medical care, gender equity, and environmental protection. Federal policies that expanded the economy and encouraged broader participation from heretofore marginalized groups helped to fuel both prosperity and confidence. The federal role was crucial. The stories and successes of the gifted generation and of the nation are inseparable from the activist state. The New Deal had provided a model of how government could help a struggling population in the midst of the worst economic crisis in its history. But the New Deal was narrow in other respects, particularly with regard to race. The administrations of Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson not only preserved the gains of the New Deal, but they also expanded its programs, added new ones, and welcomed the participation of people whose race, ethnic or religious backgrounds, and gender had restricted success for themselves and, therefore, for the nation. The expansive view of federal power did not come easily. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered office a strong advocate of balanced budgets, but the exigencies of the Great Depression required the abandonment of traditional economic views. Truman and Johnson came to Washington during the 1930s and observed firsthand the benefits of an active government for common men and women. Eisenhower, serving in the military, cheered Roosevelt's New Deal as an opportunity to cleanse the government of forces inimical to the nation's well-being. The positive results fixed their belief that a modern economy required some government direction and involvement. British economist John Maynard Keynes argued during the 1920s and 1930s that government spending increased demand and boosted consumption, creating a cycle of prosperity. That cycle kept wages from falling, enabling workers to maintain strong demands for goods and services. In this view, wages were less a cost than an asset. A strong labor market ensured a healthy national economy. Keynes's insights derived from his understanding of the modern economy. It had grown so complex and interconnected globally that the operation of the market alone could not guarantee prosperity or even a measure of equity. Government intervention was necessary to balance competing interests and maintain a strong level of employment. To achieve this balance, Keynes advocated major public works investments as a strategy to keep wages level. He understood that such activities would create deficits, but the ensuing prosperity would overcome the debt. Keynes also believed, without contradiction, in free markets. The tendency of modern business and capital was toward concentration and away from competitive free enterprise. Government's role was to maintain a competitive economy, which meant guarding against concentration. While consolidation brought efficiencies, it also created the danger of wage decline and inflation, both of which would harm the overall economy. Keynes's thinking on this point would find resonance with a young American political historian and presidential advisor, Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who compared government to an umpire. Government would not direct play, but would enforce the rules ensuring a level playing field for everyone, from the great corporation to the minimum wage earner. The balance between public and private enterprise would ultimately be a political decision. Its resolution went to the heart of a democratic society. As Keynes noted, the political problem of mankind is to combine three things: economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. In the 2 decades after World War II, the nation's political leadership, particularly the 3 presidents, sought to create and perpetuate this combination. Keynes's 3 things were, of course, interconnected. Individual liberty would flourish in a strong economy that tilted towards social justice. The architects of deregulation, from Ronald Reagan forward, assumed that unfettered capitalism produced a vibrant economy. To the contrary, it generated instability and, eventually, serious disruption. As Keynes asserted, when the capital development of a country becomes a byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done. He became a staunch proponent of government regulations to rein in unfettered capitalism. Keynes wrote, "The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already, and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which, at present, are not done at all." 80 years earlier, Abraham Lincoln said much the same thing. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. Dwight D. Eisenhower employed the Lincoln quote often, usually to fend off conservative critics. Truman and Johnson practiced it, and all employed the standard to expand the role of government. Princeton sociologist Paul Starr argued that democracy relies on the ability of political power to control strictly economic forces. In other words, a good government not only promotes prosperity, but also preserves liberty. It balances the people's interest with the corporate sector's. Citing the Progressive period, Starr noted that the era's legislation was a common recognition, a collective revulsion against the privileges of great wealth allied with great power. Government became the countervailing power on behalf of the people. What government became in the decades after the 1970s was a partner in a coalition with corporations and Wall Street, providing deregulatory cover and a favorable tax structure. The commonwealth ideal disappeared. The Keynesian view adopted by Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson understood that the era of small businesses and cottage industries had long disappeared, and that an active government was necessary to rein in the formidable power of the corporation and protect the interests of the people by keeping the doors of opportunity open. Their administrations bolstered labor unions and promoted the Keynesian management of the economy, and they undertook great projects such as the interstate highway system, the conquest of disease, and the guarantee of civil rights. The government expanded educational, scientific, and technological opportunities, and, through its regulatory initiatives, ensured safe food and drugs and cleaner air and water. These enterprises were beyond the capability and means of individuals and corporations. They were, therefore, appropriate projects for government. The federal government during these post-war years seemed to be following city planner Daniel Burnham's dictum, "Make no little plans." Government was bold. Government was innovative. Government was good. The three presidents played a major role in moving the government to extend the pursuit of happiness to a broader population. They often worked against members of their respective parties. The presidents also sometimes pulled against prevailing public opinion, particularly with respect to their civil rights and immigration initiatives. A majority of Americans did not clamor for civil rights in the years immediately following World War II. They did not demand gender equity, a clean environment, or medical care for the aged. They voiced strong disapproval to loosening immigration laws and expressed concerns about federal intrusion into elementary and secondary education. The presidents used their pulpit, their influence with lawmakers, and their rhetoric to place these issues on the legislative agenda. All three presidents were 19th century men, though Johnson was born in 1908. They grew up in economically troubled families, in small towns and on farms in borderland areas, and with strong, well-educated, and doting mothers. The basic history they learned at school shaped their views. For Truman and Johnson, William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner from Nebraska, was a hero. For Eisenhower, it was Abraham Lincoln. The three presidents had a clear sense of what government could do, and, more important, what it ought to do. They preferred to look forward, not back to some golden era. Nostalgia irritated them, though they were keen students of history. And because of that historical knowledge, they had a good sense of where America ought to be heading. The presidents had long careers in public service before entering the White House. Two of the presidents attained the highest office, initially by accident, and the other entered the White House with no experience in elective office. These circumstances likely enhanced the freedom they felt to engage in visionary thinking and in advocating policies that looked ahead to a more inclusive nation, rather than back to a more recognizable but restrictive past. They drew upon values from their own pasts to forge a future befitting a modern and diverse society. The gifts of a good government stimulated innovation, freedom, and upward mobility for millions of Americans in the post-war era. Not equally, but sufficiently so that America in 1970 bore little resemblance to the nation emerging from World War II in 1945. An accessible and affordable college education, a cornucopia of new jobs in a vibrant, transforming economy, universal health care for the elderly, and the conquest of the summer scourge of polio created the best educated, most affluent, most inclusive, and healthiest Americans ever. The results were beneficial for the gifted generation and for the nation as a whole. Individual success enhanced the collective. They were mutually reinforcing. That was one of the key features of the commonwealth ideal. The federal government did not guarantee success for the gifted generation, but it opened opportunities for Americans first and foremost by securing the basic needs of food, security, jobs, and shelter. The government created the beneficial context within which individuals could reach their greatest potential. Striving for what was now suddenly attainable, these early boomers closed the gap between what was and what ought to be. Their horizons expanded, and so did their accomplishments. A sense of liberation accompanied these advances, liberation from traditional stereotypes and taboos, liberation from norms that prescribed specific roles for different groups, and liberation from orthodoxy, be it political, cultural, or religious, that constrained human actions and interactions. The brief interview excerpts in this book derive primarily, but not exclusively, from Brooklyn's Samuel J. Tilden High School class of 1961. Class members were born between 1943 and 1945, squarely in the time frame of the gifted generation. The interviews do not comprise a scientific sample, but are merely examples of first and second generation American kids who benefited from the gifts of the post-war era. They excelled not only in academics, but also in artistic and musical pursuits, which they combined with their professional careers. They applied that creativity to those careers, innovating in science, technology, and finance. The high school was named after failed Democratic presidential candidate Samuel J. Tilden. In typical Brooklyn fashion, that failure had been spectacular. Tilden won the popular vote in the 1876 presidential election, but through Republican chicanery lost the electoral vote. Tilden, therefore, was not merely a loser, but a tragic casualty of the Reconstruction era. I can never recall an instance when either faculty or students ever referred to his Republican opponent other than as Rutherford B. Hayes. For long-suffering Dodger fans, and for all of us who experienced the condescension of Manhattanites, this unusual historical event generated a melancholy pride. Tilden High was firmly rooted in the East Flatbush section of Brooklyn. Many of the students' parents had moved to the area just after World War II. It was part of the odyssey that Russian, Jewish, and Italian immigrants, or their offspring, undertook from New York's Lower East Side to Brownsville in Brooklyn, and then to East Flatbush. It was an aspirational middle-class to lower-middle-class neighborhood, and it included some public housing as well. The Dutch Reformed Church, where we held our Cub Scout meetings, was a lingering remnant of a time when the area comprised larger homesteads and farms. Synagogues, Jewish community centers, and Roman Catholic schools and churches became the dominant institutions of the district, along with Tilden High. A few Protestants attended Tilden High, and I met one during my 3 years of attendance. Of the 5,000 students who enrolled in Tilden in the early 1960s, 97.9% were either Jewish or Italian, by one estimate. By the time we reached high school, and likely before, all of us understood that white Protestant men ran the country, dominated its politics, its major corporations, its elite educational institutions, and the clubs that perpetuated that power. Many of us knew firsthand how these folks discriminated against blacks, Jews, and Italians, which is why we understood that we had to be not only as good, but better. which fit in well with the chip-on-their-shoulder attitude of Brooklynites. I recall many of us crowding into a square near Eastern Parkway and Utica Avenue in Brooklyn on a cool fall evening in 1960 to hear and see candidate John F. Kennedy campaign for the presidency. It was exhilarating to contemplate the possibility that one of us, for that is how we viewed Kennedy, could actually become President of the United States. There, on the makeshift wooden platform, sat Congressman Victor Anfuso, born in Sicily, and Congressman Manny Seller, whose grandparents were respectively Jewish and Catholic German immigrants. These were our people, and it suddenly seemed as if a barrier had been breached. It was the beginning of many such breaches in that wonderful decade. We did our part, but we also had an active and resourceful government at our backs. In 2006, the New York City Department of Education declared Tilden High a failed school, and it ceased to exist as a high school. It was a cruel irony considering how important it was for the strivers of the post-war era and how many notables it turned out, such as labor leader Victor Gottbaum, White House counsel Leonard Garment, baseball star Willie Randolph, civil rights leader Al Sharpton, and the numerous less well-known but equally accomplished former students whose stories appear in this book. 3 smaller experimental schools filled the space, but in 2010, Tilden closed its doors for good. Tilden is a metaphor for what has happened since those promising years in the 2 decades after World War II. Experts explain such events in terms of demographic changes, disintegrating family structures, and economic transformations, not only in Brooklyn, but across urban America. But it is also an indictment of our public policy during the past 40 years. By the late 1960s, the great surge of government programs, expanded opportunities, and the confidence they generated were subsiding. The commonwealth ideal did not go uncontested during the preceding 20 years, and challenges increased significantly in the 1960s. Since FDR's second term, a coalition of Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans had battled federal initiatives. Southern Democrats fought to keep the definition of citizenship in their jurisdictions to whites only. Conservative Republicans, perennially suspicious of government and wary of ethnic and religious diversity, joined in opposition to the Commonwealth ideal. They supported restrictions on immigration and labor and opposed many federal initiatives such as the GI Bill, major infrastructure projects, health care assistance, aid to education and scientific research, and environmental protection on both budgetary and philosophical grounds. Religious conservatives rebelled at perceived assaults on traditional gender roles, the banishment of religion from public life, and court decisions against school prayer. Ultimately, these factions would coalesce in a restructured Republican Party by the 1970s. The racial disturbances that rocked the nation's major cities between 1964 and 1968, and the growing opposition to the Vietnam War from 1965 onward, deepened the growing national divide and expanded the opposition to an activist federal government and diminished trust in that government. Older, conservative Americans, including the white working class that, initially at least, did not identify either with Southern Democrats or conservative Republicans, reacted sharply to what they saw as a descent into chaos and a threat to patriotism. The very size and consequent influence of the early boomers also grated on some older Americans. In education, income, and home ownership, the gifted generation exceeded their predecessors, especially in the nation's metropolitan areas. The declension of the industrial heartland, the growing assertiveness and visibility of blacks, women, and religious minorities, and the loosening or disappearance of cultural standards fueled the conservative backlash. Rather than a momentary flare of resentment, these sentiments would persist into the next century. The Republicans exploited it, and the Democrats did little to heal it. In January 1967, Time magazine honored the under 25 generation as its Man of the Year. From the vantage point of a half-century later, the magazine's predictions...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?